Hello, welcome back. This is lesson 3 on how to let go of that past baggage that's still weighing on you. My name is Gabby, and today I'm going to be talking about in lesson 3 what to do if you are in a situation where you still have to interact with certain people that have caused you pain or struggle, and they are not in a situation or an emotional maturity where they are capable of receiving your apology and moving on into a new phase in your relationship. Now, this also applies for any time you interact with someone who triggers, this is a totally different person, but who triggers a memory from someone else who is very similar. So these are basically the new rules of engagement that you have to commit to in order to not get pulled back into your past. This is really key because we're getting into the action steps on how to not make your tomorrow a reflection of your past. Because a lot of times, the reason we can't just have closure and move on is because of the fact that we don't do this step. And so as much as we maybe felt our feelings and we know our story, if you don't do this step, basically what happens is that you recreate future situations that model past experiences, which creates this cumulative conglomerate of experiences that almost feel like one experience. They all feel so similar that it's almost like they get hurled into this big bucket called my pain, and then it feels like you're still holding on to this pain, and you can't distinguish where it really came from because it's all been so similar, because you keep continuing to experience things that reflect your past because you haven't taken these action steps of defining how to move on. So here's the gist of this video. We're talking about the 3 Ds. You have to define what it is that you are no longer going to do. You need to get clarity on what is no longer acceptable to you. You need to decide, and this is all about your internal commitment. You need to internally decide what you are no longer going to allow into your life, and you're going to 3, don't let anyone cross that line. So once you get clarity on what your boundaries really are, and whether you are committed to upholding those boundaries, you do have to enter the asserting that boundary phase. Do not let anyone cross that line. So essentially this video is about boundaries, but it's also about the internal boundaries that you have to set, and why sometimes people say like, you need to set a boundary, but they don't tell you what goes into how you set a boundary. How do you even know what your boundary is? So at this point, I hope you've done enough self-reflection on your story to be able to answer this well. But to do the first thing of defining what it is that you no longer want to allow into your life, you have to have clarity on what it is, the exact small things that truly bothered you. Kind of like how in lesson 2, I asked you to actually get to the root of what it is that you feel like was stolen from you. Like, was it really that, I think I used the example that, was it really that I feel like I had to be responsible, or is it that I was was it really that I wanted to have more joy in my life, or was it really that I specifically wanted to have more friends? Whatever that specific is, same thing is gonna kind of apply here. You need to define what it is that was actually the thing that caused you the pain. Was it a certain sentence? Was it a certain behavior? And I know that there's a lot of things, like this is not one that we're gonna try to minimize into just one thing. There's possibly gonna be a huge list of things that drove you absolutely insane, hurt, they were terrible, that person did this thing. Like, you can have a lot of small specific things, but what matters here is that you define what those things were. What was that behavior actually? If I think back on a memory and I ruminate on a past memory of someone, if I were to say like they treated me bad, they were emotionally manipulative, I could probably narrow it down into certain conversations. Now, of course, the farther you get from those memories, the harder it is gonna be to remember what those conversations were. But you can start to think about what specific thing in that conversation was so hurtful. And what caused you so much pain, because I can think about conversations, and I've kind of gotten to that point where I'm so far from some of those past memories that it's hard to clarify. But I do know that during the phase of healing that conflict, I had to think about what it was that was so bothersome. And it was like, in any situation, the hardest people for me to forgive there have been 2 key narcissists that have existed in my life, and And maybe it's a narcissist for you, in which case you have lots of books that can help you figure out what the actual behavior is that is not okay for you. But narcissistic behavior is very much like, one, I remember being very irritated by condescension. Two was lying, or a sense of saying one thing at one time and then basically not living up to what they say they're going to do or be, or that sense of the person they tell you that they're kind of going to be. And I'm sure there's a couple other things in there if I were to think about it further, but those two are good enough examples to show the point here of, I have to be very conscientious about the fact that those things are not okay. Condescension, a condescending tone, talking to me in a condescending way, and basically pretending to be someone you're not, are two things that I am not okay with. Now, for sure, for some people, maybe you're not going to be as triggered by those two things. But maybe the more you further along your personal development journey you go, maybe they will start to bother you too. Whatever it is for you, it doesn't matter. It's whatever things personally trigger you the most, that's for you to decide. But you have to decide what those triggering things are, because if you don't, you're just gonna fall back into them because they're so familiar and comfortable. What becomes our reality is based on usually just what feels familiar, and that's why we end up repeating the past, because the past is familiar, it's a known reality. And so you have to define what those things really are. You have to get clear on, that is the thing that is no longer acceptable in my life. Zero, no chance of it. I also, one thing I've also chosen to go with this is like, I no longer accept emotional immaturity. That is a very big one. I do not accept people, and it's not that I don't accept people, but I don't accept them into my life and allow them into my life if they do not have the capacity to communicate their emotions like a child and have fits or tantrums type of thing. And how many people do you know who still do that? A lot of people. And I would recommend everyone to have this sort of boundary, because you don't want that type of energy in your life. Of course, there's situations where you might have to be more compassionate. Obviously, if it's a kid, that's a different story. And if you're in a relationship with that person, you just have to, it takes a lot more navigating. But regardless, you have to define what it is that you are no longer going to allow into your life, because that's not the person that you are anymore. I'm done with this, okay? Now that brings us into the second one, the second D, which is to decide. And you have to decide from an internal standpoint. You don't have to do anything yet, but you need to look yourself in the mirror and you need to ask yourself whether you're serious about this. Are you serious about moving past this victim story? Are you serious about becoming someone different? And I know earlier in this course, I want you to take the space to really give yourself all of the loving kindness, all of the compassion, all of the empathy you possibly can. And you might have to go through that phase a lot longer than it will take to enlist this phase. You might be in lesson 1 for like 2 years, and then one day you're gonna wake up and you're gonna decide to do this one, and it's gonna take one day. But the thing is, you do have to get to this phase where it's time to stop whining about it, it's time to stop crying about it. If you want to move past it, you have to make that choice. And this is one of the unfortunate parts where you have to man up or enter your masculine energy. We get to do our feminine healing in the beginning, and now we have to enter our masculine energy of choice. And so now we have to make the choice and the commitment that even if the temptation to enter the familiar past is there and it kind of feels enticing in some way, maybe, and this is interesting too because you have lots of dynamics at play. Remember that a lot of times we look for people in the world who reflect something that reminds us of our parents, and they're either the antithesis of our parents or they are similar in some way to our parents. And so this is another reason why we end up repeating the past, because we are drawn to people that in some way feel like either what we had or was the opposite of what we had as kids, and therefore we end up being drawn to it. We're drawn to certain people who are like this, and that doesn't matter what type, in what relationship. It could be even as a boss, you're drawn to this type of person. It could be obviously romantic relationships is the most common one, that you're drawn to this certain type of person. And you have to decide that even though it is comfortable and familiar, because familiar is familial, even though you're drawn to that familiar relationship, you don't want it anymore. You've decided that this is no longer in alignment with the future you, your highest self. That's in alignment with your past self, your childlike self. Maybe not your authentic inner child, but your child defense mechanism self. So you have to decide. There's no action you're gonna take on this other than you have to create the internal will that you want your future happiness more than you are addicted to your suffering. Now, number three. The number three is oftentimes the hardest for us. But number three really shouldn't be hard if you've done number two. If you've decided and committed and defined what it is that's not okay, then you have to not let anyone cross that line. You do not let anyone cross that line. You have to assert the boundary. Now, as a conflict avoidant person myself, and trust me when I tell you that I really am a conflict avoidant. So I know there's a lot of people out there who feel like this absolute terror about the idea of having to assert a boundary, especially when they're already in a bad situation with someone. It's terrifying. But you have to remember that it's terrifying because you feel in some way as though you are not good enough. There's a couple dots connected there, I know, but all of our fear of conflict is rooted in some sense of, let's follow this train of thought here, okay? So oftentimes when we say, I'm afraid of conflict, or I don't want to say something that hurts someone's feelings, or I'm worried someone's gonna be mad, I'm worried we're gonna get in a fight. Okay, well, what you're really afraid of is being disliked, or at worse, abandoned. You're afraid of being rejected or abandoned or disliked. Okay, well, going further than that, why are you afraid of those things? Well, you're afraid of feeling like there's nothing out there to prove that you are worthy and good enough and valuable and significant as a human being. And that's, like I've shared in previous lessons, that's the root of so much of this. You can't move on from your past until you've healed that sense that you are somebody who is valuable and worthy and good enough without anything or anyone in the world to prove it to you. So sit on that, think about it. That's a lifetime process of healing that, but we have to move closer step by step to get there, because then you're just gonna live in conflict avoidance your whole life. If not, you'll be able to assert your boundaries and create the future that you wanna move toward, to create the relationships you want to move toward. So when it comes to asserting your boundaries, I think a big key that has helped me as a conflict avoidant person is to rehearse the boundaries that you need to set. And I think the simplest way to do this is just like you would write maybe a letter of forgiveness to yourself, or a letter of forgiveness to someone else who you're never going to show it to. You're going to practice writing how you want the conversation to go. How do you want it to go when you have to assert that boundary? A lot of times we have recurring conflicts with people. So you might in the moment have this argument and then you didn't know what to say to assert the boundary. But then that night you can go, or the next day you can go reflect on that conversation, knowing that something similar is going to come up, or even you can address the thing that happened in the past. And you can go to that person and you can imagine writing to that person and write it as if you were going to say it in the conversation. Like, hey, this experience that happened yesterday? Well, here's how I perceive that. And it's kind of similar to how you move through the let go process. You have to explain your thoughts and feelings of, hey, you did this. I thought and felt this way, taking ownership that they didn't do it. Just like, I thought and felt this way when you did that. And this is no longer okay with me. I am not okay with this. And you don't have to place the blame on someone else. That's how you can kind of move forward into doing this with a little bit more of compassion and loving kindness, is that you can assert a boundary, but you're just saying, hey, this is my boundary. In a way, it's not personal. This is just my choice. It's nothing to do with you in a way. It is, obviously. But that's how you can kind of phrase it, in the sense hey, this is just my boundary. I have chosen, this is my circle. I have full ownership over this vessel and my being in this world. And this is my choice that I'm having this boundary. So you can either kind of work with it, or you can no longer be in my life, or we can compromise. If you're working with people who are much more understanding, usually there's compromise to be made. But you're probably not gonna have to assert a boundary with someone who's willing to compromise. So that person's either gonna meet your boundary, they're gonna respect it, they're gonna work around it. Or if they cannot, if they repeatedly cross that boundary after you assert the boundary, that's the hard part, where you have to really remove that person from your life. And depending on the situation that you're in, that can be complicated. And that in itself could be its whole masterclass. But honestly, if you're at that point where it's that complicated, you need coaching, because there's so many degrees of variability there. But this is the general overview. You have to be able to say what it is that bothers you. You have to know what it is so that you can say it. And you have to commit to it, because if you don't commit to it, you're not going to be able to go through the hard work of facing that possibility of conflict. And to face that possibility of conflict, you need to focus on the fact that you are valuable and worthy even if someone is mad at you. That's simple. If someone is mad at you, it doesn't make you a bad person. You're still good and worthy and good enough. And you need to assert that boundary and say, hey, you know what? I understand why you did this, I understand this thought that you had, but here's how I think and feel. And this is no longer okay with me, and I'm not okay with that. And so you can meet that boundary and respect that boundary, or you can go a different way. And that's the gist of how you're gonna handle the relationships going forward. If you meet someone and you get pulled into the temptation of wanting to repeat basically a past pattern of how you interacted in a dynamic, you really have to go through this process a lot of times. You're gonna have to go through it even from without meeting people and when you do meet people. So when you are out in the world and you interact and you find someone who kind of is reminding you of something from the past, try to catch it sooner. Try to notice it sooner, and remember that you are committed to being a different type of person, and that you really don't want to repeat the past. As much as maybe your dopamine addicted brain or suffering addicted brain wants to lead you into, you have to remember you want something more. So that kind of covers this lesson on how to set those boundaries and how to interact with people who are not really at the phase of ready to accept an apology, create closure, and move on into different paths. This is kind of one of the variations of how you're going to navigate people who are triggering past baggage and you're ready to move on and away from, or you're just navigating that gray space. So hope this video helped. Namaste.